Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Current. This is Real Talk on Real Topics. I'm joined with Curtis. We're excited for another episode today. Today, we're going to be talking about the Sabbath, and I realize that there might be some listeners who may not know what the Sabbath is. So I feel like it'd be a great place to start, just kind of explaining what is the Sabbath? What does it mean? What is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is sort of the part of Christianity that Christians know is a thing, but they don't really know what to do with. It's like, oh, I know there's this thing called the Sabbath, and how does that work out for me in my faith? Like, maybe I'm supposed to take it easy on Sundays a little bit more. We're not really sure. And I think you're right. A great place to start if we're going to think through as Christians, hey, how do we relate to this idea of the Sabbath is, what is it? Kind of how does it start? And so the Sabbath is something that's taken from the Jewish tradition, part of their faith. They have this Sabbath day, and it's part of the Ten Commandments we talked about recently, to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy. So for the Jewish people, Saturday is the end of the calendar week. It's the seventh day. So on those Saturdays, they would enter into this day of rest is what the Sabbath is. And really, it's meant to reflect and to look back at the Genesis story. Yeah, exactly.
Where God is creating. Seventh day, he rests.
Exactly. So they look at this, they say, okay, God, after this act of creation, after this cycle of doing, of working, of being productive, God himself takes a day to rest, to enjoy creation, to see that it's good. And so God gives his people a commandment to observe this Sabbath day, to remember it, to keep it holy, and to rest from certain activities. And so we find that in the Bible, there's not a whole lot of specifics in the Old Testament for what this Sabbath rest looks like. There's not a ton of rules for do's and don'ts. This is mainly taken from Leviticus 25. And in this passage, we see some things that they're not supposed to do when they're working on the tabernacle, stuff like that. And so what happens is, as the tradition develops in Judaism, we get these in what they call the Mishnah. And so this is sort of their oral Torah. It's sort of the oral tradition of Judaism that eventually, a few centuries later, gets written down and kind of compiled. And so much like the Catholics look to the magisterium or the teachings of the Catholic Church, the Jewish people look to this sort of oral tradition. And in this, it lays out these 39 different categories of labor that they're not supposed to engage in. So I looked up a few. These are really interesting stuff. When they talk about resting, they mean it very seriously. So part of these observances means that there was no sowing or reaping, right? Nothing that deals with like farming, gathering. You couldn't knead dough. You couldn't bake. You couldn't tie or untie anything. That's breaking Sabbath. You couldn't even make loops to like begin sewing. That's considered work for the Sabbath. It went as far as like you can't write letters. I think maybe it was a maximum of like 2 letters. There was some sort of rule for that. You couldn't erase. You can't light fires. You can't extinguish fires. So all sorts of rules. They're being very intentional about saying, hey, on this day, we need to chill. We do nothing.
That's crazy.
We hang out.
I mean, I get why. Like, I understand. Obviously, you hold to this creation account where God finds it important enough to rest. So I think there's obviously value in that. Yes. But I will say, like, being raised in church, the Sabbath wasn't really emphasized for me ever. And I don't know, like, even in my entire life in church, it's not something that's talked about a whole lot, but I get it. I get why it's a thing. I get why it started. And of course for us, like, we value the scriptures. We value what the Old Testament says. We see the importance there. But ultimately for us, it always comes back to Jesus. Like, what did Jesus have to say about it? As we interact with Jesus in the Gospels, does Sabbath come up? It does. But like, let's kind of shift the focus there. So now we understand kind of what the Sabbath is in its entirety. But now what does Jesus have to say about it? Like, that's kind of at least the main thing for us here at Rhythm is Jesus is always the center and the focus. So I know of a couple instances that I can think of in the New Testament where Jesus essentially gets in trouble.
Right, with,
religious leaders for doing something on the Sabbath.
Right. He's breaking some Sabbath rules for sure.
Yep.
And you're so right. When we're trying to think through, hey, as Christians, how do we relate to this? Yeah, we want to look at Christ. We want to say, what does Jesus say here? just like any sort of Old Testament portion of the law, we realize, hey, not necessarily for us. The law calls for, circumcision of all males. We don't feel the need to do that as Christians. We realize something's changed in between this old and new covenant. So I think you're so right. How does Sabbath transfer over to this new covenant? And Jesus does some strange things. He gets in some trouble, like you said. I think of there's one time where Jesus is wandering through the fields with his disciples, and they're picking grain to be able to eat on the Sabbath. Again, no sowing, no reaping. This is big no-no. And so they're like, Jesus, whoa, hold up. You're doing work on the Sabbath. And he pulls this interesting thing where he says, hey, he references this Old Testament story where he sees that David and some of the people ate from this priestly bread that was supposed to be consecrated and only used for that. Yet they bend this rule to sustain themselves, to find food. And Jesus pulls from this story of Scripture to say, hey, these rules aren't necessarily this rigid thing that needs to be abided by. And he speaks of it as saying, hey, man wasn't made for the Sabbath. Sabbath was made for the man, right? We're not built for this sort of role. No, this thing was made for us to safeguard, to help and protect us. And he says for us to be wandering through and to pick some food and sustain ourselves is a good and okay thing.
Jesus is just brilliant.
He is, man.
He's always just like, to be alive during that time, I think he would have just like blown my mind.
Oh, yeah.
Because he always gave answers. Like he always answered the questions, or I guess sometimes he didn't answer the question, but he answered it in a way that was, I think, unexpected.
Yeah.
A lot of times, or he would say something that just like got him to be quiet.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like Jesus is the ultimate like gotcha.
Yeah.
Like so good where they're like, don't do this, and he opens up their Bible and says, look at this story, and they're like, crap.
Yeah.
Another instance is one time where there's a guy who's got like a withered, decayed hand, and so Jesus is coming forward to heal this person, to liberate him from what's going on, and the Pharisees are standing around, peering down the end of their nose saying, is this guy gonna perform a miracle, do work on the Sabbath? And Jesus looks around at him and says, oh my goodness, like which of you, if you had a donkey that fell into a pit on a Sabbath, wouldn't reach down and bend up and pick it up? Why would I not heal this withered man's hand? And so when it comes to looking at how Jesus engages with the Sabbath, like you said, what does Jesus do? The way that I've always explained his relationship to the Sabbath is that Jesus prioritizes people over rules.
That's right.
The priority emphasis is placed on the people. I think Jesus wants to safeguard what's important about the Sabbath and rest, and we're going to talk a little bit about that too. But at the base level, Jesus wants to say, hey, how can I prioritize people over these rules around the Sabbath? People need to eat. There's no need for them to starve because they're trying to keep Sabbath. Yeah. To be healed, to be set free from some bondage. You'd lift up a donkey. We can heal a man's hand on the Sabbath. So Jesus is just trying to reorient the priorities and say, it's not on just the rest, it's not on the keeping. Yep. It's made for our wellness, our flourishing is what the Sabbath has in mind. And if we're engaging it in ways that don't contribute to our flourishing, then we're kind of doing Sabbath backwards.
Yeah. And I know we're specifically talking about Sabbath, but I think this is just a good point to just stop and break and just say, if some of you're struggling with this idea or this notion that you got to keep these rules when you're in a relationship with God, like that's the priority is X, Y, and Z. I got to fulfill these rules all the time. Just know that in Christ, he is way more concerned about you as a person than he is about you following the rules. Now, if you're being transformed by the Spirit and from the inside out, you'll end up following some of those rules as a byproduct. Yeah. But Jesus cares way more about you as just who you are than about you following the rules. And there's just some freedom that I think comes along with that. But even more specifically, like we're talking about in the Sabbath, there's some freedom there, knowing that, hey, like, Jesus cares about me. He cares about my health and my rest more than it is following a rule. And, I know we were talking about this maybe a little later, but there's some even like denominations that really just kind of get after that whole idea. And it's very, very important to them. But not so much for for us. Well, rest is important, which we'll talk about. But there's some just freedom there, knowing that Jesus, even in the scriptures, we see him caring more about people than following a bunch of rules.
Just following the rules. Yeah, it's good to know. Like, and we as Jesus followers should be those same sort of people. Like, how can I prioritize the people over these sort of religious rules that are set around me? And I don't want to, Judaism bash or say that
No.
all Jewish people practice the Sabbath the same way. There is room for in certain rabbinic literature that talks about it's okay to break Sabbath for helping in medical emergencies and stuff. So there's room in this tradition to see Sabbath a little bit better. But what Jesus is combating here in the first century is they would have this sort of practice where they would call it like fencing the Torah, which is like, hey, here's a Sabbath thing that you could break. Well, we're going to put some extra rules outside of that, prevent you from even being in instances where you could break or be around these things. And so they call it, fencing the Torah. And they would kind of add these extra traditions. And Jesus speaks a little bit about those too, and some of the issues he has with them. But I think if we're going to look at how Jesus relates to Sabbath in the New Testament, not only do we want to say, hey, okay, how did Jesus engage with Sabbath practice? But I think Jesus does even more than this, and he kind of comes and says, here's how to do Sabbath. But more than that, he says, I am the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Come here presented to you. One of the things we see, Jesus says, all those who are weary and heavy burdened, come to me and I'll give you rest. He offers
passages of scripture. Yeah.
So good. He offers rest to him. Jesus says, hey, this sort of Sabbath is pointing towards something. Creation is in this cycle of work and moving towards rest. It's moving towards this ultimate rest that we're going to be seeing. And the author of Hebrews speaks about this final rest that we're looking towards, this final Sabbath day rest. And I think Jesus comes saying, look, I am bringing this. I'm bringing the fulfillment of the law. In me, you find this final Sabbath day rest. No longer a need to work. No longer a need to strive and toil. You're here. You've arrived. Part of the Jewish tradition, too, is they would have every 7 years, they'd have like kind of a Sabbath year, which was kind of a bigger reset. But then every, I think it's 25 years, they would have this year of Jubilee. And this is sort of a total economic reset. The land gives time to rest from being plowed on. It helps ensure some of the rest of the land for crop growing. But there's also rules about releasing indentured servants who have been in this sort of economic place and releasing them and restabilizing and re-equalizing and putting all things kind of back. And I think Jesus comes and says this sort of Jubilee of Jubilees, this 25-year, what you're waiting for, it's come, it's arrived, Opening the scroll of Isaiah, he says, I'm the Lord's anointed to present good news to the poor, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, to release the captive. And so Jesus comes to us, not just saying, hey, it's a good idea to rest on the weekends, which there's some need for rest, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But he comes and says, this Sabbath, what it's pointing towards, the signpost, it's here. And so I think it's a good reason for us as Christians to say, how do we relate to the Sabbath? And that's probably where we'll move. But for us, it's not this rigid need to keep a particular day of rest. What's the need for the signpost when we've arrived at the destination? If we have some signs that says move this way and this gets you to Oklahoma City, well, when you're in Oklahoma City, no need to abide by the signpost. You're there. Yeah, exactly. N.T. Wright gives a really great quote. I love the way he puts it. He talks about it this way. He says, you don't need the alarm clock when the sun is flooding the room with its light, right? We don't need to have anything to wake us up and bring us. It's already there. It's already arrived in full. So I think another great way for us as Christians to think about Sabbath is to think about this rest that Jesus has brought us and invites us into that is full and efficient and satisfactory.
Absolutely. And, my wife and I, we've had conversations the last year or so just about just kind of the freedom and really the rest that we can find in Jesus. He's really being raised in a kind of a very legalistic type environment where there are all these rules you have to follow.
Yeah.
There is so much freedom and rest to be found in Christ. And but this has a lot of, I think, implications for people's lives, how they live their life. And we no doubtly live in a culture that is obsessed and infatuated with work.
Yes.
Hard work and hamster wheel type behavior,
Yes.
Like, there is data on this, this isn't just my hypothesis here.
Right.
Like the United States in specific takes way less vacation time than other parts of the world. Way less, like not even close. We literally work ourselves to death, and we champion and celebrate hard work. Now, there's a good side to that. I'm not saying you should not be a hard worker. I'm not, I'm going to be very clear. I'm not, celebrating laziness by any means. But there is something to be said about being intentional about taking time off being intentional about resting. Mainly because I think it leads to some deeper issues, like finding our identity in what we do.
Yes.
You know, we become what we do. We are what we do. And our identity is tied to that.
Yeah.
And without taking time away, you don't really get to see that. You kind of have the tunnel vision on, you know, you got the blinders on, like a horse running down the track. Like you can't see the beautiful life there is all around you when you're just like thinking you're just tunnel visioned down the path. And I think a lot of people live their life that way. They miss out on so much that life has to offer because they work themselves to death.
I think there's a culture in America of just sort of like, embrace the grind, you know, like get after it. And that's what it is. And the hustle and do that and make yourself. And I think we are sitting in a culture that is just infatuated with efficiency and production and to make and to do and to be more efficient. And how can you do that? And we do, like you said, this hamster wheel mentality. We're sort of running this rat race, and we can in this culture confuse ourselves. Yeah, we are what we do. And I think, a great book, if I could recommend one, is a guy named Walter Bergman, who's a really great Old Testament scholar. He wrote a whole book on Sabbath called Sabbath as Resistance, I want to say is what it's called. But it gets at this idea of like, this is combating this culture. It's resisting that. It's pushing back against this narrative that says, I'm just a cog in the production machine and I'm only valuable and life is about as well as I perform that function, and calls us back to say, no, it's not about producing and product and getting bigger and growing, but like there's room for rest, for not being efficient, for being lazy, so to speak. Even God rests.
And one of my favorite just kind of leadership principles, like if I would ever speak at like a high school event or like to young people, I used to say this all the time, and this isn't my original thought, but I love it so much I always share it. It's always a mistake to decide what you're going to do before you first decide who you're going to be. And again, everything in our culture, even like our education system, what are you going to do? 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 What are you going to do when you're older? Like, what are you going to do when you grow up?
So true.
Like, that's always the question that's just shoved down everybody's throat. Is like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? You know, but I think a better question is first determine who you're going to be, what type of person you want to be, and like who you are then can dictate what you do. And when people get this backwards, you see what happens. Like, I think, again, I'm a huge fan of grace and second chances. But I think of like a person like Tiger Woods, who from the moment he was a child, and there's an excellent documentary, by the way. I can't remember if it's on HBO or they just came out with one. But they talk about his childhood and just how much pressure like his dad put on him. But from the time he was 2 years old, they knew what he was going to do. You know, and so and it worked. He turned into literally the world's greatest golfer. He still is probably today considered the best of all time. But as he became an adult, he just made some terrible, terrible life decisions. Like, I'm talking like moral decisions. But now, what's unfortunate about that is he decided what he was going to do before he decided who he was going to be, and there's moral failures now. Now, unfortunately, kind of how he's remembered.
It's
is oftentimes marked by those decisions. And I think if you would have decided, you know, like, this is who I want to be before what I'm going to do, maybe you could have avoided some of those things. And again, no one's perfect. We all have issues and hang-ups. But I just think as a general principle, I wish our culture decided, like, pushed, like, who we're going to be before what we're going to do. Again, it's just a byproduct of this idea of, like, we are what we do. And it's just, we're funneling the machine, you know.
That's so good.
So I don't know. I just think as a whole, I love that idea, that language that you use, where we're combative. We're kind of going up against what culture says is appropriate and how we should go about our lives.
I even pulled up a Bergman quote that I just would love to read because I think it hits it so well what you're saying. Walter Bergman says, in our own contemporary context of the rat race of anxiety, the celebration of Sabbath is an act of both resistance and an alternative. It's resistance because it's a visible insistence that our lives are not defined by production and consumption of commodity goods. I love that. It's an act of resistance saying, no, we're not going to live our life that way. We're not going to buy into this culture of, we're just efficient in producing product. And yet it's also an alternative. And this is a beautiful thing. I think this is what the church should be at its best in all areas, not just about rest, but about love and about creation care, whatever. The church should offer a viable alternative and say, hey, here's how the world works. Here's its testimony. Here's some counter testimony. Here's what it looks like for us to abide in a different way of life. And so I think that's a beautiful option the church has right now, is to say, in a world consumed by efficiency and drive and grind and get after it, what would it look like to be a people who say, like, actually, I find room to rest and to not be consumed by those things and realize, yeah, I'm not my level of efficiency.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. And I think a practical question that I ask myself all the time. I've asked our staff this. I ask people that I deeply care about. I'm a coach. I asked one of our players this the other day. And it just kind of helps me, I feel like, stay in that balance of rest and identity and work, because I do want to say, hey, like, you should work hard at what you do. Like,
yep.
There's also scripture that talk about whenever you do work,
do it unto the Lord.
Yeah, like, and work hard and do it with honor and dignity and respect.
Yes.
And, don't, like,
tons of stuff in the Proverbs.
Yeah, and don't like, abuse positions of, like, whatever. I mean, you go on and on. I do think you should work hard. Yeah. But I think a gauge, like a good barometer for me, has always been, like, if all of this was taken from me tomorrow, would I be okay? Yeah. Like, I saw that question all the time. Like, if I were to lose my position of work tomorrow, would I be okay? Yes. It would stink, yes. Like, I would be upset for sure.
And rightfully so.
But deep down, like, my work is not who I am. So, yes, I would be okay. Yeah. And, like, I've been able to get to that spot, but I know, like, friends who, when I ask that question, they're like, no way. Nope. No way. Like, I would not be okay, And I think if you're listening, like, just ask yourself that question in regards to your work. If you were to lose it all tomorrow, for whatever reason, whatever your work is, would you be okay? And I think that kind of gets at this idea of rest, finding rest in Jesus and saying, you make me whole, you complete me. You are all that I need. You are sustaining me, not my work. I'm not a byproduct of just the culture that's become so much of our identity. Yeah. And I don't know. I just feel like that's a kind of a decent gauge, a question to ask.
I think it's a great barometer, a good way to just ask ourselves and say, how much are we tied to and defined by what it is that we do? And those are good questions. Uncomfortable, but good.
Less about, like, I'm not talking about would you be okay, like, I know you won't be able to pay your bills. Like, I get the anxiety and fear behind that. Yes. It's more about, like, a soul-searching thing. Like, would you be okay without your position? Like, thinking you could get another job somewhere else. Like, but would you be okay with that? Like,
is your identity lost and crushed because you're no longer, whatever.
Or in this certain position or doing this thing for work,
Yeah. I think that's so good. I think, there's tons of professions that happens, but being a pastor is one of those where you say, like, man, am I a pastor? Am I what I do here? Like, or am I also just Curtis and a person and have that, or we both? So, just good questions, to be asking ourselves. Maybe a good place to kind of land is, how do we see the Sabbath working out in the lives of everyday Christians? Because I think some people will say, okay, what does God expect of me in Sabbath keeping? Should I be kind of soloing out a day? And, like, how should that work? I feel like it's a question I get a lot. Do you feel like this means, like, you gotta on Sundays don't do X, Y, and Z? How do you feel like you navigate a little bit of that?
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily. Again, I think it's more of a posture, and I say that a lot. Yeah, it's more of a. I hate to say this word, but lifestyle. It's more about, like, a position, a posture of rest. Yes, daily. I mean, so much of the Christian life, like, we see this in the scriptures too, where Jesus even says, like, take up your cross daily. It's a daily thing. Like, each and every day you can choose to have a posture of rest in Jesus. Yeah. And that's what I feel like rather than just, like, a specific day. Now, if that works best for you in your schedule, I wouldn't be opposed to that. Like, if you do have a certain specific job where it's just a grind and, like, you need to take a day, then do that. Yeah. But I think, again, it's more of a posture of rest daily. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's so good. And I think about passages like, we did a sermon series to the book of Colossians, and at the end of one of the chapters I taught on, Paul says, so don't let anyone, like, judge you about your observance of a new moon or a Sabbath day or that. And he says, this wasn't the substance. The substance is Christ. And so I think Paul, and Jesus would be a fan of this too, is to say Sabbath keeping in that sort of traditional sense is sort of redundant. Like, it's already here. The rest has arrived in Jesus, so we don't have to keep on doing that sort of thing. Paul says if you don't take your Sabbath on Saturday, like, tell them to, like, go kick rocks. Like, Jesus has come. You don't need to worry about it. So I'm right the same way. I would never, there are some denominations we talked about, like Seventh-day Adventists or something, who would say very stringently, like, yes, on Saturday we observe a Sabbath, much like we see some traditional Jewish people keeping.
Sure.
But I think I want to go along with Paul and Jesus here and say I don't think that's the case. I think you're right. We want to embody a posture of rest. We want to find time to rest, and it can be that day throughout the week. I think that's a good thing. But if you're saying, how do I apply this Sabbath as a Christian, I think it means, one, just continually daily finding your rest in Jesus. That's practicing Sabbath. And I think, two, whether it's a little bit of time each day or a day out of the week or whatever, building in time into that schedule to say, I'm going to actively resist this culture that's telling me to just be efficient and to produce, and to say, no, let me get in with God's pace. And there's a little bit different. There's room for rest there.
Yeah. And just the last thing I'll say, and we'll close. I've seen what not honoring the Sabbath looks like, even in my coworkers, where one guy in particular who I love dearly took another job at another church, and he was pretty much forced by his elder team, like, you have to rest, because it was good for his health. And that's what good leadership does. They recognize behaviors and patterns, and I've seen just how damaging it can be. In fact, the first pastor I worked for was so prideful about working all the time, and he would miss his kids' games and stuff like that, just because he was working.
Jesus weeps. It hurts.
I think that's not what Jesus wants. This is, at the end of the day, it's not what I want. So I've seen it firsthand. I've seen how damaging it is. So, I would encourage you to find ways to rest. And, if you have more questions, or continue dialogue, or if you have maybe a specific instance you want our input on, or how you can maybe help you specifically find rest in your schedule, we'd love to do that. So thanks for listening today. Thanks for joining us with another episode here of The Current. We'll see you back here next week. Grace and peace.